Join me on this quick recap of the Dubai Learning Summit led by NEASC and KHDA and get an insight into presenting at an international conference. My journey started in wintry Germany, and I was seen off by some wonderful geese. Now, I always think it's a good omen to be seen off by animals before I leave for a conference. And then next thing you know, it was me up in the air flying to somewhere warmer. I managed to sleep through most of the flight, but I was very excited about the conference and going to Dubai again for the first time since my honeymoon. Once we landed, I quickly got my bags and made my way through the airport, quickly getting into a taxi, which was only about a 20 or 30-minute drive to our hotel. Now, Dubai is a beautiful city, and again, the geographer in me was geeking out. With a wonderful view from the hotel room, I was really able to take in the city and even get in a quick walk before hitting the hay and resting up for the first day of the conference in the morning. I was greeted by a beautiful sunrise as I made final preparations before getting on the coach, even being able to see the Burj Khalifa in the distance. The bus journey to the school was a very short trip, and boy was the school something to behold. Dubai Schools Al Barsha is one of the most incredible campuses I have ever visited in all my time seeing schools around the world. With a founding team including Joe Kotarski and Anita Stewart, the current head of the school, you knew that this was going to be a fantastic place. Now, the students were helping out throughout the whole event, and all of the people I met who worked at the school or contributed in some way were all brilliant. And hopefully you can see from this quick walkthrough just how incredible this campus is, the open spaces for teaching and learning, and just the general welcoming and very open feel to the area. So this is the room, or one of the rooms, where I was presenting across the 2 days. Well equipped, and I was thoroughly excited to set up and check everything was working. I mean, even the views from the windows were something to behold. And after taking in the view, the conference was underway, with several notable keynotes including Her Excellency Aisha Moran, and then in the afternoon I got to present my session from Intent to Impact, Embedding Wellbeing in School Culture. A massive thank you to all of the participants. I'll be doing a post about some of our discoveries later. Following my session, I got to take part in a panel about language with Sharyn Skrtic and just spend time with people and make some new friends, hanging out with the other presenters, and spending time with people, learning about them, learning from their expertise, and just making connections with people who normally you're working with remotely via LinkedIn messages or emails, and also getting to reconnect with people like Trillium and Athena, who I've worked closely with in the past. The conference was fantastic. It was such an enjoyable and joyous space, and I really recommend attendance to these kinds of events whenever you get the opportunity, especially if you get the chance to present. Then on the final trip home, got to have one last glimpse at the school and its incredible surroundings, and then have a quick moment in the afterglow before hitting the gym. After all of that conferencing, those flights, you got to loosen up the hips and you got to be ready for a good night's sleep before getting on another very early morning flight. So I did all the preparation that I could. I had a beautiful evening ahead of me. I was packed, ready to go, and got into my taxi. But then I had to run back to grab my jacket, which I'd left, and then spend the rest of the time contemplating, am I going to miss my flight or not? A wonderful final journey. But thankfully, there were many, many beautiful things for me to, distract myself with. A little glimpse at the Burj Khalifa through the buildings as we traveled. There was a beautiful sunrise on that journey as well. So I managed to get into the airport, and due to how well the airport runs, I was still able to get in, check in my bags, and feel a little bit relaxed before getting on the plane and taking off to return home to Hamburg. Now, I was floating at this point, so I slept through a lot of the flight, but awoke in time to recognize, it's back to -7-degree temperatures. So it was still great to be home. Now it's time to rest, recoup, be grateful, and look forward to the next time I get to spend time with brilliant people.